Hey everybody, this is Scott Allen Miller. On Sam IT today, I'm going to tell a story about the cheapest, crappiest, most awful SAN ever. Why would I tell a story like this? Well, it's funny. I talk to people about storage all the time. This is an area that I'm very passionate about and an area that a lot of people take an interest in. And a lot of times people associate the concept of a SAN with something being big, expensive, insanely fast, and incredibly reliable. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. First of all, SAN is a technology. It is not a reference to how nice something is, right? That's a weird kind of concept that people have. SAN is obviously a technical thing. It's something we talk about in IT. We don't use it as like an adjective. It's not like, oh man, that car is so nice, it's SAN. It's not like that. That's weird. Nothing in IT is like that. We don't use terms like that. That doesn't make sense. Yet SAN, for some reason, has all these odd connotations connected to it that are completely untrue. SAN has to do with it being a block protocol over a network used dedicated for storage. That's kind of it. I mean, we'll go into more on other videos about exactly what a SAN is, but all of those theories that it means that it's large or that it's fast or that it's reliable, none of those are true. It's not that it means it isn't any of those things. All of those things are options, but they're just options. Just like with a car or a server, you can get any given car or server may be big or fast or safe, but you could also get ones that are small or cheap or dangerous. It's just picking the right thing or, going for the factors that matter to you. But a SAN is just a technology. The reason that I want to tell this story is because a number of years ago, Netgear made a consumer, believe it or not, SAN that was the best, most raw, useless piece of junk you could ever imagine. And they quickly got rid of it. But they put it on the market. I happen to own one. And I love keeping it because it is the best example you could possibly have of just how crappy a SAN can be, and yet it is 100% a SAN. There is absolutely nothing about this device that is in any way not a SAN. It meets every criteria, both every criteria of the most technical SAN and every intention of being a SAN. Unlike some other things we'll talk about in another video where like a USB external hard drive might actually be a SAN. This is something purpose-built and designed and documented and marketed as a SAN and meets every criteria. What this unit had was, it was just a little unit. I should have seen if I had one. I own one, but I don't have it where I can put it on the video. It's a tiny little toaster. It looks like one of those little 2-bay NAS devices that everybody now sells, but this is not a NAS in any way. It's also important to note that unlike many of the low-end SANs today that are almost universally both SAN and NAS, and they vary by how you use them, this was a pure SAN device. There was no NAS functionality at all. Nothing but SAN. So this little toaster unit held 2 PATA drives. That's the old parallel ATA drives with the big fat ribbon cables with like 80 pins. And you would slide them in. It was not hot swap. So you had to slide them in, plug in the cables, put on the plastic face, put a quarter on it to lock it in. And it had a tiny little fan in the back that kept them from overheating. Actually, I think it was in the bottom. It was gravity-fed air, so as it heated up, it would come through. But I'm pretty sure there was a small fan to keep it moving. And it had 2 NICs in the back, if I remember correctly. And the internal logic of the device was nothing except a tiny, tiny board that took the parallel ATA and put it over the Zeep SAN protocol directly onto the TCP/IP network. There was no local configuration whatsoever. Everything had to be done from a remote tool. The remote tool could only set the IP address of the drives and nothing else. That was it. There was no RAID. Now they marketed it as having RAID, but the RAID had to be software RAID running on the client machine. So there was nothing on the SAN of RAID at all. It actually presented each drive as an independent target at all times. There was no exception to this. So 2 IP addresses, each one was the ZSAN protocol, which is kind of like a crappy version of iSCSI with way less going on. And that was it. There was nothing else. There was no formatting, there was no monitoring, there was no special services, there was no snapshots, there was no RAID, nothing. two completely independent drives that for all intents and purposes were just cheap versions of external USB drives, except instead of a USB connector, they had a network connector and an IP address. That's it. They operated exactly like a USB drive. The upside was you could use them exactly like a USB drive. So places that would be like, oh, you can't use a NAS, you can't use a map drive, this would work fine. Any place that you could use a USB drive, this would work, except incredibly slow. It actually only had one NIC that shared both of these, and there's an important reason why I just remembered that. Sorry that I forgot that. One NIC. So it's not even failover NICs, nor is there a dedicated NIC for each drive. That meant, and also needed to be noted, it was 100 megabits per second, not gig-E. So if you wanted to access both drives at the same time, which you would if you had them configured as, say, RAID 0, remember on the software side, or you simply wanted to use both of them at one time, or if you wanted to copy something from one drive to the other, or even if you were using RAID 1, because the RAID was coming from the workstation side or from the server side, not from inside the SAN itself, both channels of the, sorry for the squeaky chair, both channels of the drive for RAID 1 had to talk over the network. So that 100 megabits per second NIC had to send 50 megabits to one drive and 50 to the other. So doing something like RAID 1 would cut the overall speed of each drive in half. And if you were doing something like actually two operations, it would actually cut the speed dramatically down. And if you were writing to them, like RAID 1, it would have to write to both of them independently. So unlike normal RAID where you expect to get equal performance, it would actually cut the performance of the entire array in half because it had to send everything twice because the RAID wasn't where you expected it to be. This was a disaster. It wasn't safe. It wasn't easy to use. In order to connect to it, you needed a special driver, just like you need iSCSI enabled on your desktop or server or whatever. ZSAN had to be installed and enabled because nothing comes with ZSAN natively. So even that was not easy to use. It was a terrible design. It was incredibly slow, incredibly unsafe, and incredibly confusing because it looked like what people thought would be a NAS, but was a SAN. And as we know, SANs are confusing and people often make mistakes with them and do terrible things like try to share them between machines, and SANs certainly never have any kind of arbitration for doing that. But this is a device that with its cheap ZSAN and literally no protections had no way to limit you from connecting from other machines, so you could trivially mount it to multiple machines at the same time and of course destroy your data. No arbitration. Everything about this thing was terrible, but I love it because it's the most raw SAN device you can ever have. There is no pretend, there's no extra, there's no layers of things to try to make it be awesome by hiding just how little it actually is to be a SAN. So it's a great learning device, and it's actually so incredibly bare that it's hard to really visualize just how useless this device was, and yet how pure of a SAN it was. In all the years I've worked with storage, I've never seen a SAN device that was more pure SAN. They all have some features that they're trying to use to beef up the SAN, whether it's, the most basic RAID in like a Drobo SAN. They always come with RAID, and some upper level Drobo SANs start to come with caching and all kinds of things that aren't actually part of the SAN nature. They're just features that are on top of the SAN. But this was a SAN with no bells and whistles whatsoever. So you got to look directly at the SAN itself and see what that meant. And it meant some big problems. I really encourage people to go out. If you can find one of these, they're fun to play with because they're so ridiculous. It's hard to describe just how slow it is. And when you start thinking about RAID that is happening remotely, you start to put together just how big of a disaster this is. Imagine how bad it would be if you were doing RAID with two USB external drives and you're using software RAID to try to put them together. Now imagine it's third-party software RAID, almost fake RAID. In fact, one could argue that the SC-101's packaged RAID system was actually fake RAID in a really awkward way that was so obvious that it's hard to hide the fact that it was fake RAID, but that's often the case. And so fake RAIDing two USB hard drives together, and then imagine how much worse it would be if those two USB hard drives had to share a single USB connector in order to do the RAID, and how much there would be network contention problems and just the lack of stability in something like that, and the unbelievable performance problems from having the RAID actual logic sit so far from the actual devices. We're so used to our RAID logic touching the hard drives, like on a RAID controller, that there's no latency, there's no network bottlenecks between the RAID and the drives. But this put huge bottlenecks and massive latency and contention between the RAID logic and the drives, and it was just insane. So that is my story of the Netgear SC-101. It was replaced by the SC-101T, which was more or less the same unit, but with a upgraded, classier looking box and a Gig E connector, which did help a lot because the 100 megabits per second was a ridiculous bottleneck. But other than that, it was the same completely insane device. Neither of them was on the market for very long. They're very hard to find, but if you look them up, they are relatively interesting and just a great educational piece for just taking away all of that stuff that people get confused by with SANs and looking at just what it means to be a SAN. So next time someone tells you that they have a SAN and they expect you to just think it's a wonderful thing, remember, all it means is that it's block storage over the network. It doesn't imply anything positive whatsoever. It's simply a technology and one that can be easily abused. Thanks for joining me. I hope this was interesting. It's a great story and a great little device to play with. Remember to like and subscribe and put in your comments below if you have used an SC-101 or 101T. Totally, you gotta talk about it down below because this is a ridiculous device. Everyone needs to know. I've never met someone who purchased one of these ever. So I want to know what your stories are with one of these. And if you've used similar devices that are a little bit better, like Drobo SANs or whatever, feel free to jump in and talk about those. Those are pretty close, but a little bit better in some important ways, like, RAID. Thanks for joining me. If you want to sponsor us, remember you can do so on Patreon.